Welcome to our webinar today titled Nonviolence Activism in the Islamic World in a Time of Islamophobia. My name is Dr. Asna Husin. Previously, I directed Nonviolence International's Peace Education Program in Aceh, Indonesia, and currently a research fellow here in Washington, D.C. I wish to thank all of you for joining us from around the world. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban. For those who are new to us, Nonviolence International is a backbone organization of the nonviolent movement founded in 1989. We provide fiscal sponsorship, training, and knowledge to partners all over the globe. We tell transformative stories, emerging nonviolence movements that give us hope in difficult times and are reshaping what we view as possible. Myself founded a Nonviolence International project teaching Islamic peaceful action and ethics to over 75,000 high school students during the civil war in Aceh, Indonesia in early 2000s. Our webinar series is called We Are All Part of One Another. This is a line from the great feminist nonviolent activist Barbara Deming. This line, we are all part of one another, is certainly reflective of the ancient truth that lies at the heart of all religions. It is also the core of the scientific understanding of humans as social and interdependent creatures. The purpose of this meeting is to explore the vast creativity of nonviolence resistance in the Muslim world today. My good friend, Dr. Mohammed Abu-Nimer, will host today's interactive conversation. Mohammed Abu-Nimer is a Palestinian American. He served on the board of Nonviolence International. He is also a professor at American University and a globally renowned expert on conflict resolution, peace, and nonviolence. Professor Abu-Nimer has been both author and an editor to more than 13 books on nonviolence and faith-based peace building, including one entitled Nonviolence and Peace Building in Islam, Theory and Practice. We are extremely honored to have such an accomplished host on this important topic. Without introduction, I will hand over the remaining program to Dr. Abu-Nimer. فليتفضل يا أخي.
Thank you, dear sister Asna. Good to see you again. And thank you for your warm and kind introduction as well. Also for the introduction on the Nonviolence International. It is indeed an honor to be here today and to be trying to host and facilitate this conversation. It's an exciting topic, and also it's much and well needed in the international context, in the domestic context, in the national one in the US, and also all across the world. This is my second hosting a webinar with the Nonviolence International series, and I'm really excited to do this. We have four amazing speakers with the stories and really incredible set of both research and the practice as well. And I can't wait to hear them and see what each one of them will share with us all in this important topic. Just a couple of points now, and then I'll come back to you in the concluding remark once we do the discussion as well. So we will hear from each of the speakers for a few minutes, and then we will have some discussion and the questions that we will write in the chat or raise your hand, and then we will end with a concluding remark, reflection on the input from our speaker. the challenge today is really how do we link. Originally, we wanted to talk about non-violence in Islam, and then we went back and forth with the different speakers and different organizers. And I think then we link it to Islamophobia, and I'm excited about that link because it can ground us in some good examples from the Muslim world, from the non-Muslim world as well, and see how non-violently we are dealing with Islamophobia as well, because often the discussion of non-violence in Islam in many ways shifts or over-focus on the change in regimes, a change in governance, and revolutions and social movement and social change, more on the macro level discussion. But hopefully today, the 5, 6, 7 of us who will share input, we will be able to make the link also to the Islamophobia and answer some of the question and give some good examples in how Muslims around the world and non-Muslim around the world, inspired by their faith, by their tradition, are illustrating non-violence and peaceful ways to respond to Islamophobia. Without further ado, I want to start with the first speaker, a colleague, a friend, and in many ways also mentor, Chaiwat Satha-Anand from Thailand, and Paul Connor, if you can, as we do, if you can post, or Michael, if you can post the biography of a Chaiwat on the chat so everyone can see it. I don't want to read it all, but I want to say that if there is anyone who written about this topic of Islamic non-violence, it would have been Chaiwat Satha-Anand from the 1986. When I started doing my dissertation in 93, his resources, his work was really the very first thing I looked at. He's a professor at Thammasat University in Bangkok, and also director of the Thai Peace Information Center, which conducts studies and activism in relation to Thai military and social issues. He's an expert on nonviolence and Islam and activism. He also had the National Committee, I know he was telling me, Commission on Nonviolence, on Reconciliation in Thailand. Lots of experience with the Chaiwat. I'm very happy, Chaiwat, to see you with us and able to make it. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Muhammad, for the kind words. I want to explain this. This is not in preparation for my sleeping. This is because I have problems with my neck muscle. So just to make that clear. Let me begin this way. A quote from this. Oh Allah, how much blood we have to give to have peace in our life. We have been shedding our blood for decades, and now we are here. Please help us. We want to go back, said the Imam. We want to tell the world that we want our rights back. We want citizenship. We want our homes and land back. Can you guess from which country this quotation is from? This is from the organizers of the Rohingya protest, saying that we are Rohingya in August 2019. This is the Rohingya's Muslim peaceful protest in Bangladesh, when up to 30,000 Rohingya joins a rally days after Bangladesh, with the help of the UN Refugee Agency, attempted to start the repatriation of 3,000 plus Rohingya Muslims. None agreed to go back though, because they are citing fear for their safety and a lack of confidence in Myanmar. What I want to do here is that, based on the work that I have done later in my nonviolence and Islamic imperatives, I have maintained that nonviolent actions are in fact the religiously prescribed mode of struggle for Muslims facing present-day deadly conflict, and engage others in conflict as human beings whose lives are precious. What I want to do here is to pose a question that I believe is relevant. In what ways have Muslim nonviolent actions been affected by the present context of Islamophobia? To answer this question, I argue that for Muslims nonviolent action to work in such difficult contexts, the dynamics of Islamophobia needs to be understood, the issue of fear of Islam itself critically addressed, so that its poisonous effects could possibly be mitigated. Now, Islamophobia, I wanted to pose 5 questions. I want to problematize it. First, this is fear of Islam, but fear of what? Fear of Muslims, fear of their belief, fear of Islam. What are you talking about? Second question, where does the fear come from? The number of Muslims, demography, issues of conflict, you know, because we want to build mosques in the middle of Europe, perceptions in the media, or history, you know. These are the sources of fear in different society. As a result, the third question, Islamophobia everywhere is not quite the same, and I want to emphasize this. I think Islamophobia in Thailand is quite different from European Islamophobia. So the question is, how many types of Islamophobia Muslim nonviolent activists are facing today? And I would suggest 4 here. There, of course, could be other typology. But I want to say that first type is the state-sponsored Islamophobia. Myanmar, China comes to mind. Myanmar against the Rohingya, China against the Uyghur. The second type is non-state-sponsored Islamophobia. Thailand, France, for example. Third type, Islamophobia among non-Muslim majority. And this is not the state, this is the majority in the people. In Myanmar, in Thailand, in Sri Lanka, there is some kind of Islamophobia by the non-Muslim majority. Very interestingly enough, these are all Buddhist societies, Theravada Buddhist societies in Asia. The fourth type is Islamophobia among non-Muslim minority. Indonesia, Pakistan comes to mind. Now, the fourth question about this is, how has such fear of Islam or Muslims been sustained or spreaded? I have no definite answer, but I'm now I'm heading a small think tank in Thailand, and we are looking at the epidemiology of Islamophobia through soldiers who came to fight in southern part of Thailand and return home. So with the returnees, it's not only the PTSD, the wounded, but the experience, the story, the feeling that they have on Muslims. And this is part of the problem that I think make Islamophobia spread. The fifth question is, how can the dangerous effect of Islamophobia be mitigated? To answer this question, I suggest that Muslim nonviolent activists have to be clear about what they are fighting against. Are we fighting against Islamophobia itself? You know, CARE, for example, in the US is fighting against Islamophobia on different fronts, or fighting for self-determination, for example, Southern Philippines, Southern Thailand, in the context of Islamophobia. These two are very different. Third issue that I want to bring to floor is Muslims nonviolent action in the context of Islamophobia, a story from Southern Thailand. Since 2004, violence in southern Thailand between the Thai state and those who have fought for self-determination based on the religion of Islam, the Malay ethno-cultural reality, and the land historically annexed by the modern Siamese state has claimed more than 7,000 lives and wounded more than 13,000. In 2010, we, meaning my and many friends, launched a project called Cultural Fluency to bridge that then and now corroding relationship between Thai Buddhists and Malay Muslims in areas of deadly conflict. In its almost a decade of working in this space of violence, the project has moved from earlier working on how culturally different peoples could live together to a much more difficult question of how to help them live together when the relationship among them has all but shattered like a broken glass as a result of the accumulated effect of violence since 2004. The Cultural Fluency Workshop aims to help participants explore their own understandings, beliefs, and cultures, listen to those who are different, identify sources of cultural biases that so dangerously affect social cohesion. Now, let me give you one example of how difficult it is for people who have to make decisions on others in just such a situation and why the project is important. A Thai Buddhist driver of a public health official agency had to travel on the road in a remote area in Restif, southern Thailand, one night. On a dark road, a woman dressed as a Malay Muslim in her hijab stood in the middle of the road, beckoning the car to stop. In that split second, the Buddhist driver, the driver is Buddhist, had to decide between either stopping the car or crashing it into the frail body standing there in front of his car. He was thinking that if he stopped, the woman might be a decoy and her people hiding behind the bush might come out to attack and kill him and others in the car. These are some of the stories he had heard. The woman, but if he ran the car into her and she was not a threat, he would have killed an innocent person. Weighing all options, the driver decided to stop the car. The woman approached. In her silent voice, she warned him that the road ahead was rigged with nails and the dangers awaited, meaning some people were waiting to attack it. In this case, the tragedy was avoided because the driver luckily chose to follow his heart instead of giving in to common stereotypical belief about the Malay Muslims informed by Islamophobia among many Thais in just such a case, in just such a context. He was confident enough to overcome this Islamophobia. And the work that we have been doing is trying to bring to fore the bias within and also to strengthen the sense of self within him. Now, the last point is, in what ways can Muslim nonviolent action contribute to the reduction of Islamophobia? I say that we have to go back to the roots of Islam and nonviolent actions. In the context of Islamophobia, nonviolent activists have to go one step further than to think about nonviolence in general. That is to provide action platform for people of all kinds of diversity to participate in their nonviolent struggle. In addition, Muslim nonviolent action activists have to find ways to help those whom they are fighting against to feel more secure, to not afraid of them. The people will say that this is, dreamland or something like that. I don't think so. This is possible because of two reasons. Two reasons. One, nonviolence as a weapon of fighting is different from the use of violence in that it can differentiate between a person's life and his or her activities in life as a human being, where no other weapon of violence can, meaning nonviolent action sees those it is fighting against as humans. Nonviolent action presupposes the attempt to overcome one's fear in order to do something to change the world to be a better place, but then also to look at the others as human beings. The second point is from Islamic resource or inspiration. I'm sure Karim will say more about this later, but let me quote you one ayah from Surah 5, Ma'idah. Ayah 35, the Quran says, because of this did we ordain unto the children of Israel that if anyone slays a human being, unless it be in punishment for murder or for spreading corruption on earth, it shall be as though he had slain all mankind. Whereas if anyone saves a life, it shall be as though he had saved the lives of all mankind. Now, I would argue that Islam's principle of nonviolence points to how one human life is equal to the whole of humankind, and therefore taking one human life is almost unimaginable unless one is prepared to kill the whole humankind in such an act. To contemplate the meaning this way of quantification of human life is to construe the ways in which a life is seen in a web of relationship. And there's the Barbara Deming that you, Asna, quoted this earlier. With the whole of humanity, that one life is equal to all lives is possible because from a cosmic perspective, this is not unlike when one sees a grain of sand which contains the lifetime of the whole planet Earth. To see one life as equal to all lives means, among other things, to be able to see the others as a world in and of him and herself, and to also see oneself in that world, especially when that others are made to be the enemy out of fear, Islamophobia, who perhaps had blood of one's family on their hand. Through such a powerfully enchanted sight, saving one life can be understood as saving the life of all humans. And therefore, the task of Muslim nonviolent activists today have to do that without leaving those they are fighting against behind, but to also help them overcome their fear of Islam and Muslims so that deadly conflicts can be mitigated and creative conflicts among us fostered. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chaiwat, for this both comprehensive as well as detailed with some examples from South Thailand, the Rohingya, and some good stories also that you shared an example. I like the five categories you put on, and I am sure when you get to the theological foundation of it, we will hear some more from our esteemed speakers as well. So thank you, and I am sure we'll get back to you. We will go to our second speaker, Hala Al-Karib. Hala is from Sudan. She's a full-time feminist, social justice activist, and research practitioner who intensively and comprehensively work in the Horn of Africa region. And she's the currently director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa and editorial head of Women in Islam journal as well. You'll find some more information about her background in the chat. Hala, the floor is yours. Please feel free to respond to the question. Also, if you want to comment as well on what you have heard from our previous speaker. Chaiwat, thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Hala Al-Karib, and I'm speaking from Khartoum. I'm Sudanese, and I'll be speaking about our experience during the Sudan, the latest event of Sudan uprising, and our engagements in peaceful protests that has led to overthrow of 30 years of militant Islam dictatorship that has been controlling the country and holding the population of Sudan hostage to this destructive and very dark ideology. I'm going to start my my talk by sharing a very short story about my engagements during the Khartoum sitting, and I think it was a historical event, where the Sudanese people has continued to protest in front of the army headquarters for over a month and a half, 24/7, non-stop, taking shifts. People that came from across the countries, villages migrated from remote areas to peacefully protest against the totalitarian regime that was on control, and just hoping for a peaceful transition. And that was the only tool we have. The sitting was an amazing space for us to be able to speak about who we are, debate our identities, and part of the conversations that we had during the sitting is to discuss and debate, religion and how the militants and fanatic Islamists who took control of our country, for over 30 years, has been terrorizing us using religion. And of course, I'm going to speak from a Muslim majority perspective. I mean, Sudan is predominantly Muslim populations, and I remember having conversations about about progressive and different interpretations of Islam, and having a conversation about ijtihad and research, and approaching our religion and our faith from a different angle and perspective that respect us as human beings, particularly speaking about women and women's rights, and the past regime has terrorized the Sudanese people using a very, assuming that, a very strong gender discriminatory language, legitimizing the subordination of women and demeaning women and approaching women as problematic creatures. And it was a very difficult conversations against those who believe that women are naqisat aqlin within, or women they don't have the capacity to have a full faith and to be part of the Muslim faith, and that women are not fully intellectually grown, And I was talking to average people, I was talking to normal people from all over Sudan, I was talking to villagers, I was talking to young people. And for a moment, I was so impressed and humbled by the openness of, of my people, of the Sudanese people, by their tolerance and by the fact that despite their, attempt to comprehend what I'm saying, those are people who has been exposed to militancy and Salafism for 30 years, yet they still remain open and interested in having an alternative conversation and talking about the religion and faith from a different angle. And that speaks to the fact that Sudan religious pluralism is deeply ingrained in our history. We are a nation of Sufis, and this is how we adopted Islam. And if you travel across our country, as an African Muslims, if you go to Nuba Mountains or to Darfur, you will see our shrines, across the country, and we see our appreciations of our different tariqats or Sufi sects. So historically, this is who we are, and that's that's very telling. And I think that what helped us, sort of to resist, those dark times, of militant Islam. For the first time for Sudanese to become, to understand or to interact with quote unquote formal religion or state religion, it happened during the colonial era, when the British, they needed a formal Islam to approach Sudanese society. So they institutionalized religion, they controlled it, they established the first religious institute in Sudan. And was so, for us, when we look at it, when we look back at this, we can see clearly this is how, when the, when the state started to exercising and to have control over religion and to define people's faith. And I think we paid a very heavy price, because in my view, that was the introduction into political Islam, and that was the introduction into militant Islam, by defeating the whole concepts of pluralism within Islam that we used to have it, and live with it in a very peaceful way. So there is one thing I would like to address, that while Sudanese people has been suffering from the brutality of the militant Islam regime, which has taken control of our country, we also had to suffer the impact of Islamophobia or institutional Islamophobia, because Sudan has been sanctioned by the US for the past, and all the European countries for the past 30 years. So you can imagine, the impact of sanction and being listed on the terror list, on the country, on generations of Sudanese people, on the country populations, and how we have been deprived economically, our universities and our schools, and the labeling that we had to live through, and at the same time we had to struggle with the repressions of the political Islam. And what was interesting, that our governments at the time, they were having excellent relations with the West. They have been enjoying and appreciated by Western government due to their collaboration on the counter to terror and so on. But the Sudanese people, they were and still are being punished, by being listed as quote unquote terrorists. I'd like to mention something also very interesting that's currently happening in Sudan, and in like areas where there is tribal tensions and conflicts and so on, the peace protests that are currently happening across the country, which is people are using express their opinion. I'm talking about, villagers, and I'm talking about people who live in remote areas, and how does people understand that to be able to protest peacefully, it's probably much more difficult and much more complex, than engaging in a violent act. Yet they are consciously selecting to protest, the difficulties and the hardship they are going through peacefully, and they understand, the value of protesting peacefully. So this is right now happening across the country, and as I said, this speaks to the to the nature of of how we are engaging with our faith, with our culture, with our tradition and heritage of pluralism, which we really hope that we should capture it and regain it. Thank you.
Let me just say again, Hala, how much I enjoyed the two major points you made regarding the pluralist nature of the Sudanese society, which I think a common and well known in the Arab and Muslim world as well, especially for those of us who enjoyed the visit to Khartoum and to Sudan in general. But you also, second point about the reinterpretation of Islamic militarism. I hope in the later part of this conversation you can give us some good example and unique one about, you said it's happening right now in Sudan in across the country. What is happening across the country? And second point, what is the unique part in the Islamic application of nonviolence in the Sudanese current situation? What are the Sudanese doing from their faith to continue their social change and political change process? So thank you again. Allow me to move on to our third speaker, Mushtaq Ul-Haq Ahmad Sikandar from Kashmir, I guess, is a writer, activist who based in Kashmir and completed his Master in Political Science from Kashmir University, actively participated in interfaith activity and also dialogue. He writes up books and reviews appear regular in the newspaper, journalist in the heart of his work. He has also penned down numerous poems and short stories. Maybe we can hear one poem today if we are lucky. Mushtaq is also an activist and volunteers. He volunteers with various humanitarian organizations in the Kashmir Valley. Mushtaq, the floor is yours. Please let us share with us your experience.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Professor, for your introduction. I will start with Islamophobia in India, and then I will go to Kashmir, and then about the future of non-violence in the subcontinent. As we are aware that Islamophobia, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, is not something new. It started with the colonialism, when the British colonial historians basically divided the history between the Muslim, the Buddhist, the Hindus. So from there we witnessed that stereotypes about Muslims, stereotypes about Hindus, and stereotypes about the other started gaining ground. So what happened when the history was divided between these phases as Hindu history, as Muslim history, as Buddhist history? So its culmination we witnessed in the form of partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947 between the Pakistan and India. So it was believed, and still these stereotypes are very much relevant on the ground, that it stated that a faithful group like Hindus who worship the cow and the Muslims who eat the cow, so they can't coexist together. So these types of stereotypes also include beef. We still witness that in India. There are a number of killings that happen due to these beef bans are carried, or Muslims are alleged to have. And in other places, we also witness that there are stereotypes related to the burqa of women, Muslims being Muslim rulers being as iconoclasts, destroying temples around and building mosques at their places. So these kinds of stereotypes still continue. So Islamophobia within the Indian subcontinent is not something new. It has been perpetuated by the historians. It has been here, and it is still relevant within the Indian context. And in case of Kashmir, when the Indian subcontinent was divided, the Kashmir also, the state of Kashmir, because it was a princely state and among the biggest states within the Indian subcontinent, it also got divided between India and Pakistan. And still the dispute over the sovereignty and self-determination of Kashmiris continues. And later on, within the Indian context, the Indian administered Kashmir, to which we belong, so Kashmir has been used as a laboratory both by India and Pakistan, and particularly being a Muslim majority region, and due to the armed struggle that started in the 1990s, it was being implicated that all the Muslims, wherever they are in majority, they will fight for secessionism. They are always violent in their behavior. They will go for secession. So that's why Muslims in India, they implicated it was something similar. So it resulted in the polarization of the Indian society, and that polarization still continues. And Kashmiri Muslims particularly has been used as an entity to polarize the society within India. And what happened in case of Kashmir also, that the Hindus and Muslims coexisted before 1990s. But once the armed struggle started here, the Muslims and Pandit minority, that is the Hindu minority fled or migrated from the Kashmir Valley. So it divided completely the society. And related to the non-violent type of issues or initiatives that have been taking place, as we all are aware that Indian subcontinent has given a birth to a personality like Mahatma Gandhi, who has been an epitome of non-violence, and his method of civil resistance is certainly relevant and inspiring still millions of people and struggles all over the world. And then related to him is Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the frontier Gandhi, who basically campaigned for non-violence using the Islamic paradigm, Islamic teachings, and he also formulated the Khudai Khidmatgar, that's the helpers of Allah, as a campaign. And that campaign within the Indian context has once again been revived. So I have been associated with a non-violent initiative called the Swaraj Peeth. The Swaraj Peeth is a Gandhian initiative that works in different parts of India. Among its trustees are big Gandhian stalwarts. So one couple known as Rajiv and Neeru Vora, they have been working within the Indian context, particularly in those communal areas where there is communal violence between the Hindus and Muslims is quite prevalent, particularly in the Uttar Pradesh area. So they have worked there with the ulama. They have made these Shanti Sainiks, that's the peace army there. And in case of Kashmir, they started working since 2011. And since my college days, I have been associated with that initiative, and we have particularly initiated a dialogue between youth of the Pandit Hindu minority and the Kashmiri Muslim majority, because since 90s, there has been a breakdown among the dialogue process between the Hindus and Muslims who see each other as antagonistic and enemies. So I have been a part of that initiative, and we have been conducting different types of regional meetings. We have been visiting their homes. We have been building initiatives. And along with that, we have also initiated reading groups in which we read texts related to non-violence, particularly Hind Swaraj of Mahatma Gandhi, because it's a seminal text he wrote in 1909, and the questions Mahatma Gandhi raised in 1909 are still relevant, whether it's related to the issue of killing cows, whether it's related to the issue of communal violence, whether it's related to civilizational questions, like the tussle between the Western kind of civilization and the Eastern values, something what Samuel Huntington tried to propagate for different kind of imperialistic goals. But those civilizational questions still are relevant, and later on they were taken by Islamic revivalist movements. Like in South Asian context, it was taken by Jamaat Islami, who stated that the Muslim and these Western values are not compatible, as we find in the writings of Maulana Maududi. And later on, Sayyid Qutb also did something similar when he coined the term Jahiliya regarding the Western civilization. So we try to understand those kinds of civilizational kind of values and try to build those bridges through reading. And these reading, among these reading groups, mostly youth participate. And then due to my team's effort that are quite different than from Swaraj Peach, we try to initiate a dialogue between the ulama of different sects, not only Shia and Sunni, that's the intra-faith kind of dialogue, but within the Sunni groups also we have different sects like the Deobandis, the Ahl Hadith, the Salafis, and then the Barelvis, who are quite antagonistic to each other and who do the takfir, who call each other kafir, or their understanding of Islam as only the absolute one. So we try to initiate a dialogue between them also, and these are the 3-4 initiatives that particularly we work within the valley. And then later on, what we realized after working for more than since my college days, I have been working, and now it has been a decade long activism of reading, writing, and understanding, trying to understand non-violence, whether from the Islamic perspective as well as from the perspective of Mahatma Gandhi and other such stalwarts. We witnessed that there are certain impediments, and such impediments don't make non-violence quite relevant. So one of the biggest impediment is that we lack the role models who will stand for non-violence, because for violence we have a number of role models, and then also we don't have compatible training, because like violence you need to be trained in the use of arms and ammunition. For non-violence also you need a certain kind of training that will make your campaign successful. And related to it is another issue that in our curriculum, and particularly that's the state-sponsored curriculum, we don't have any component of peace education. Even the new education policy that was just released a few weeks back by the state government, that increased the GDP of education to 6%, but still the peace education has not been kept as a component for education or teaching in schools. So these are the few impediments. And for violence, because the media again creates a stereotypical image, and also relays if there is a violent kind of incident, there is a communal violence, there is certain kind of blast or killing somewhere. So they try to reinforce that violent culture. That's why youth get sucked up into that violence. But there are many initiatives related to non-violence. Like I talked about the Swaraj initiative, I talked about the initiative about dialogue with the ulama of different sects. And then there are organizations or campaigns like the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, that is led by women whose parents or whose husbands or whose sons have been basically disappeared at the hands of state agencies. So they have been leading a non-violent campaign for restoration of human rights, or for trying to seek the whereabouts of these disappeared people. And then we have movements, non-violent movements like the Right to Information Act, wherein the state agencies, the state institutions are supposed to be accountable to common people's scrutiny. And then you have a number of land rights movements within the Indian context, as well as in Kashmir, though they are not so vibrant, but within the India, the land rights movements are completely non-violent. And then you have examples like the Narmada Bachao Andolan, and other such initiatives where non-violence has been used as a component, as a tool, and the civil resistance has certainly succeeded in many places. And surely the non-violence way is the only method through which we can achieve a peaceful and tolerant and a pluralistic kind of society that we intend to build on. But what happens that we don't have the role models, we don't have the understanding, and our leadership, our media, our teachers don't have the understanding of non-violent campaigns. They are not basically exposed to the ideas of non-violence, and our curriculum is certainly lacking in the component of inculcating this non-violence among our children. That's why we witness that violence, though the majority community is non-violent, they are acting non-violently, but certain elements in the society are violent, and they get all the media coverage. They are relayed by the media, by the state institutions, and then also the various politicians use these violent kind of groups for polarizing the society. So for a better future, we need to overcome these obstacles and impediments that are towards realizing a future that is peaceful, tolerant, and pluralistic. I hope these are all what I have to state, and I hope I was brief and within time. And any questions, I would love to answer later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mushtaq Ul-Haq. You really spoke fast and covered a great deal of information and gave, at least I have here, 9 different examples of working through non-violence activities in different areas. I hope in the question and answer, maybe you can think of one area in which how you can explain to us all the link to Islam and Muslim identity throughout the different activities you do. You mentioned that you read Gandhi's text. How does that relate to different Islamic theological or Islamic identity? I know. And also, I know that one of my students, Asifa Kul, from Kashmir, has done her dissertation on the non-violent of Kashmiri youth in responding to many of the problems that you outlined. Just wanted to mention that. Our last but not least speaker is my brother Karim Crow, who is an old friend, old in terms of time of our friendships. And we travel together, work together as well. Lebanese-American scholar and former director of the Nonviolence International Islam and Peace Program. Karim's research focus on primarily on psycho-spiritual function of faith and the ethical and metaphysical topics and Islamic peace studies. And he has worked, in different parts of the world and on different cases. And really, it's an honor to have him with us today. Karim is one of the very few Muslim scholars who devoted their work and really career in many ways to explore the diversity and the nonviolence in theology of Islam. So Karim, it's an honor to be with you. The floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. I'm truly humbled by the diversity and depth of the presentations by Chaiwat, by Hala, and by Mushtaq. It shows us that the breadth of the Islamic experience today across all continents is incredibly pluralist and also searching for roots in its tradition, in its original formative teaching in the revelation of the Quran and the model of the experience. So we have to touch our roots, as Chaiwat said. We have to get back to our roots, and we have to understand it in a more depth and with more critical intelligence. I'm sorry if I'm a little bit theoretically oriented, but I think that activism and practice need to be rooted in a clear grasp of essential principles. We know that Islam has been painted as a tradition of bloodshed and aggression, but this is nothing new. It stems from European colonial racist attitudes towards non-white people, and that the whole war of terror against terror is in a way a kind of subdued continuation of this prejudice, which has been upgraded into a kind of geostrategic context, but deep-rooted racist and intolerant attitudes by Euro-Americans are still quite prevalent. And the colonial experience was something that deeply marked Islamic societies, that decimated the intellectual class, and that made them, in a sense, handicapped to meet the challenges of modernity. So these are some of the backgrounds when we come to how Muslims approach violence and non-violence in today's world. We have to keep in mind, of course, that Islam is not monolithic. We say Islam as if it's one thing. It's not. It's many forms of Islam, many ways to understand Islam. Some of them are deep and broad, some of them are narrow and shallow. Unfortunately, the shrill, loud voices of narrow, shallow understanding of Islam now predominates. I'm talking about Kalashnikov Islam, I call it, the jihadists, who are very ill-grounded in the breadth and depth of their own tradition. And we find this now has moved into the center in many societies, It's not marginal anymore. And people who have open-minded, tolerant, and deep and broad connections to their tradition now feel marginalized, right? As Muhammad Abu-Fadl said, the Muslims have become orphans of a lost civilization. And there's some truth in that. We have to also understand that the typical expression of Islamic intellectuality, which has been privileged, the Sharia and the juristic understanding of Islam, is not necessarily the best resource for us today in terms of our peaceful activities and our search for a non-violent presence in our contemporary global reality. The jurists served the rulers. They developed their jihad theory and the notion of the abode of war, Dar al-Harb, and the abode of security, Dar al-Salam. I say security, not peace, in a context in which they supported state enterprises for giant military campaigns which gathered booty and wealth to support a state, especially its army. And this has been well studied by scholars. I'm thinking about people like Abdurrahman Bouti, the great Syrian scholar who was killed by terrorists, unfortunately, a few years ago. And so we have to also go back to the prophetic model. The prophet preached in Mecca for 13 years, completely without violence. Then he moved to Medina, where he established a state community, a polity, religious polity, and a social, political community. And for the first 2 years, there was no violent activity. The Battle of Badr in the second year of the Hijrah. So there was a 15-year period in the Prophet's career where there was no violence. And then when he had established a social political entity, he defended it with military means. That's the key to understanding the use of military means in Islam. I can't go into too much detail, of course, but I do want to point out that there's a set of fundamental concepts which are based on Quranic imperatives and the prophetic model, which Muslims really become more acquainted with. I'm just going to show you, if I may, if I can get my thing here, we share screen. I forget about that document. I'll post it on the internet for you later to look at. I had like a couple of pages of context for this situation with our...
Or if you wish, Dr. Karim, to put it on the chat, everyone can see it now. If you can say, but we can later send it to Paul once you finish.
Reacquaint ourselves with our fundamental principles in a fresh way, in a deeper level, and that this has required us to study again our own tradition and become aware of the diversity of Muslim thought and societies, also to privilege and support much more extensive educational efforts, which are linked with the activist goals and rights goals and gender issues and children issues. And we have to also work much better at dialogue between Muslims, especially the different sectarian groups, and so that we have a more united front in terms of our global reality. And the training is something that's crucial, especially training teachers for low-level educational grades, so that they can include an emphasis on Islamic peace and nonviolent approaches in their curriculum and in reaching the youngest generation of Muslims who will grow up to become our leaders and our intelligentsia in the near future. And all of this will help us become better engaged with our global reality, and so that we can help awaken Islam as a global presence, a force for good, for peace, for justice. Peace without justice is impossible. And rather than the continued marginalization of Muslim society as effective contributors towards peace, security, and justice. Thank you, and I'm sorry about the fumble with the document I had prepared.
It's okay, Karim, thank you. We have, I think David Hart posted that on the chat. Thank you again, and you know, as usual, you really took us into the causal relationship with the colonialism. I'll come back to it later. think you expanded on it. You also really gave us why the theological foundation of any practice is very important. And I hope we can come back to that as well in the discussion as well. Thank you. And maybe just to leave you with a question, if you want to comment on it later, would be how do you propose we do that with the infrastructure that we have today in the Muslim world? Is it really at all possible? Is it really at all possible today to think of a unified theological foundation for the wonderful activism that we have heard from the different speaker here? But I will come back to you on this. We are only 5 or 7 minutes or 8 minutes late in terms of our schedule, which is great and accomplishment with such wonderful speaker. Please join me to thank the 4 of them for their wonderful input and remarks as well. I want to open the discussion for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we can go to a small group discussion for another 10 minutes or 15 minutes, if we're okay with that, with our organizer. So please raise your hand or write in the chat if you have any comment to our speakers. And we are unmuting everyone, right? So please go ahead and speak up if you even want to not write, but to speak.
This is Mubarak.
I think we know who's Mubarak. Ahlan wa sahlan Mubarak. Mubarak Awad is one of our colleagues, mentors, friend, and anyone who doesn't know Mubarak in this field yet need to look him up. He's one of the first few people who work on nonviolence resistance in Palestine, and he's also the founder of Nonviolence International. So Mubarak, you have a priority on the question and the comment. Go ahead.
Thank you. For a great deal of time in the Arab world and the Muslim world, Al-Azhar used to have a very specific command of representing Islam. And it's now completely, I felt that it is dead. Is there any other organization that are speaking on behalf of all Muslims or Islam? I'm not talking about Al-Hajj in Saudi Arabia, but is there an organization, university, or anything like that, putting Islam in front of everybody and making it known to everybody?
Thank you, Mubarak. Thank you, Mubarak. Maybe I can take Karim response on that. Karim, are you able to respond to this?
Briefly, yes.
Yes, please.
Good question. There's a contest. There is no one organization. Part of this is the pull between the Kingdom of Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Both claim to be, in some ways, religious leaders of the Islamic community worldwide. And this is part of the sectarian fault line, which has spread everywhere, to every continent now. But this is one of the shortcomings and the handicaps. The Muslims never had a kind of formal religious structure like you have a pope with Christianity or a chief rabbi in Judaism or whatever. But there must be a need for some kind of, if you want, an NGO, a non-governmental organization that canvasses and collects and projects voices of Muslims and is in touch with not only officials and states, but also community leaders, civic activists, educational and intellectual university leaders, and broad swaths of the society in its institutional form. The Muslims are way behind on this. It's been far too long, and with contemporary technology and the internet, I mean, I'm surprised that it hasn't happened before. And we need a kind of canvassing house, a networking house that links Muslims together and puts them in touch with each other and helps them and gives them the resources and the advice and the direction so that they can work in their societies, they can make progress, they can train, they can educate, they can understand, and they can teach. This is something really we need to work on. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you.
Professor Abu-Nimer, you're muted.
Okay, I'm sorry. Did again. I thank you, Karim, for the response. But I want to also add, if I can get a response from Chaiwat on this. On the question, if we frame it a little bit, do Muslims have really to have one voice in terms of theology? Is that something that asked from the Muslims, or it should be also asked from a Christian, from Jews, from Hindus, from Buddhists? Is it because this is usually in many ways a trap question that Muslims have to react to in many parts of the world? Why don't you have one Pope who speaks, one church, one Pope who speaks on behalf of Muslims, although all the other religions are not? Chaiwat, what's your take on that?
I would say that one voice can be extremely dangerous. And it depends on the kind of voice that comes out as a result, as Karim was trying to answer. I would say what is more important is the environment that makes it possible for different voices to be in fair contestation, so that people can then listen to all kinds of voices based on theological background, based on inspirational, based on the Sufi tradition and other, and then have a right to choose. What you are having as a problem right now is that certain line of voices seems to have more prominence and power than the other. I put it in the context of the contestation between great powers within the Muslim world, meaning the Saudi-led type of Islam and the Iranian-led type of Islam. What you have there is highly politicized versions of all Islam. And this is a power imbalance of voices that I think has done less service to the proliferation of alternative, nonviolent, constructive voices of how we can live together and work for peace in the world.
Thank you. Thank you again. I'm tempted to take some more, or I want to take some more reaction from people. We have about 50 or 50 so people now, 57. Any reaction? Go ahead.
Yes, hi, I'm Asna Husin.
Oh, Asna, ahlan. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I have two specific questions to two speakers.
Yes.
To Brother Mushtaq, I would like to know whether the people of the two Kashmirs are engaging one another, especially in the context of this peaceful action, nonviolence, and peace studies, and of course connected to Islam and this Islamophobia. So what the nature of connections are there? This is to Mushtaq. And then to Karim Crow, I mean, you talk specifically about the role of Sharia, and you think this is not the approach for our today Islamic world. What is the alternative? Because Sharia is at the core of Islamic practice and belief. And I mean, when you look at the Sharia in that kind of slightly negative manifestation, this is a real issue for the Muslim, even for those who are very open. So what is the alternative from your viewpoint? Thank you.
Thank you, Asna. So maybe we can go to our Mushtaq friend from the beginning, in the first reaction. Mushtaq?
Yes, about the two Kashmirs that are divided between India and Pakistan, there are very few initiatives, though there were some initiatives taken earlier for the people-to-people movement, but related to youth and traveling. Both the countries time and again impose a number of bans that don't allow Kashmiris to just travel to the other side without, if you don't have any relatives there, if you are not you're not connected somewhere through through blood ties or through relationships. So it's very difficult for Kashmiris to find a visa. And similar for the Pakistani side, Kashmiris, it's again the same obstacles and impediments. But now due to the social media, many Kashmiris are connecting to each other through that. But related to the initiatives that they are taking about peace and non-violence, I have not come across any. And maybe in future there may be some kind of a joint initiative. But till now there is no such initiative. Earlier we had a trade kind of thing, barter system going on between these two Kashmirs. But now that again has stopped since last 2 years.
Thank you. Thank you. Karim?
Briefly, if I may.
Yes, please.
The complex issue of Sharia, I didn't mean to marginalize it or neglect it. I'm just saying that the common assumption, especially among many average Muslims, that Sharia is the only proper intellectual discourse for us today is mistaken. That's what I'm saying. Let me understand it clearly. The colonials basically trashed Sharia. This is the problem. There is no living Sharia discourse anymore. The ulama who proclaim in the context of discourse based on the Sharia historically are not the same depth and understanding that we had in the past. The colonials understood the strength of Sharia and they purposely marginalized it and undermined it. Most law systems in Islamic societies today are ultimately traced back to European law codes like the Napoleonic Code or the British Code and others, depending on the colonial master who imposed it. And the Sharia has been reduced to basic family law and gender issues and inheritance and things like that, which are at the core of the Islamic identity and are very difficult to displace. Other resources remain marginalized. People like Abu-Nimer like the word theological, but theology is kalam, is a discourse relating to doctrine, creed, and arguments for faith, technically speaking. But intellectual discourse includes things like ethics, adab, and akhlaq, very rich tradition in Islamic thought. Also philosophy, which has been completely marginalized in the modern Islamic world, except for a few countries like Iran. And it's considered, heretical in some countries like Malaysia or others, and Arabia, of course. And other discourses which include science and the natural and intellectual or theoretical science. Muslims at one time were masters of science, and today they have, so to speak, abandoned that stage and simply adopted the modern form of intellectual discourse. So conflict resolution and nonviolent theory is one branch that Muslims could recover for themselves, so long as they're aware that Western conflict theory is not always exactly what the Quran teaches, but it has very close connections in certain places. So we need to re-examine our tradition. We need to uncover the lost elements which we have jettisoned and laid to the side. And this is something that is just begun. I think Mushtaq's presentation was very good in that respect because he underlined and stressed the importance for education and training. And this is really something what we need. And we need much more support and funding for these kind of efforts. And we should be careful about state funding because they usually come with strings attached. They want the institution or the organization to do their bidding to forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Karim, for outlining and responding with such a clarity of the distinction between the theology and the intellectual, as well as the emphasis on education. We have 3 questions from the chat. I want to make sure we honor them. One is from Catherine Hughes regarding the question of engagement with non-Muslim. Says that to share case studies in different countries and contexts, so it is clear that Muslims have many examples. Are there any documentation of Muslim work of non-violence need to be disseminated? A challenge that has been with us since late 80s, early 90s. How can we get more documentation of these non-violent and cases in general. That's one. The second question from Simonetta, if I am not massacring the name here, forgive me, but it's really more about, she's from Spain and she works on nonviolence and the human rights in the Euro-Mediterranean, and looking at, I'd like to hear also the need for dialogue among different religious culture to work on needs for humankind. Basically, how are we working on the interfaith in that sense? And the final question here I have, maybe for specifically for the distinction with Sufi, I think from Fatima. She says, wonderful presentation. The question is how to know on what are the best options to balance Sufi as well as Salafi or Wahhabi waves, as Muslim community may be divided along these themes. There is a need to coexist. Any best practice? For that, I want to go to Hala, because Hala really spoke about the Sufi nature on the Sudan experience, and maybe you can, and you spoke, Hala, about how the regime controlled, kidnapped, hijacked Islam and used Islam for repression. How did you, in the experience Sudan, manage the Sufi nature of the tradition versus the other types of Islam ideology that you have there? I'll give you the floor for this question.
Thank you very much. Well, basically, I'm just going to say very quickly that, you know, our ruling elites have inherited, you know, the structure, as Dr. Karim has spoke about, you know, the colonial state structure, you know, and the whole concept of controlling religion and then using it against its own population to enforce certain rules and laws and everything. And so from there, I mean, since the, you know, the independence of Sudanese state has been a failed state, because our ruling or the ruling structure, the type of governance system never acknowledged, you know, the diversity of the country. Just to answer your earlier questions about what's currently happening.
Thank you.
In Sudan. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, what has been happening is that we have been living under this constructed, militant, you know, very brutal system that assume that they are the messengers of God, and there is no other voice in terms of faith or religion, or how we exercise our faith and so on. And so they really try to kill pluralism. And I'm going to answer Fatima's question as well here. You know, I just wanted to say that you know, the assumption that militant Islamists are more brutal towards, you know, towards non-Muslims, often because people, they don't talk about how militant Islamists are actually brutal towards Muslims of different positions. And they are intentionally and extremely brutal to Muslims who has different position and different views, because they feel threatened and intimidated about people, you know, who claim their faith, you know, and individualize it and allow other people to exercise their faith the way they want and things like that. So we really struggle with that brutality. We have people who lost their lives because of their position and stance, you know, as being different, and not only Sufis. I mean, Sufis is, you know, is part of our heritage and something we embrace, definitely. And we have so many Sufis and so many, but it speaks also to how we actually, you know, sort of engage with religion, you know. It's from a plural angle, from a diverse and plural perspective, rather than from a dogmatic single angle, which is really very, very important. And So I wanted to stress the fact that, you know, that this is really very important to bring up to the conversation, that militant Islamists, they don't only victimize non-Muslim, but they victimize Muslims who are different from them way more, you know, and they kill and they brutalize them. Yeah.
Thank you, Hala. On this, again, it would be helpful if you also have just one example from Sudan across the country now, how they are dealing with non-violence resistance from an Islamic perspective. Do you have a name, a person, not a name, an activity or something to share with us?
So basically, I would like to speak about the peace protests, which is, for a long time, people, they used to feel very desperate because of the hostility of the states and the lack of respect for their diversity, being Muslims or non-Muslims, so rebelling and carrying guns and arms against the state was one of the tools of resistance. Recently, people, they start to really understand the value of engaging in the struggle on non-violent basis, and the fear disappear. People, they become more vocal about their faith and their identity, if they are followers of Sufi sects or if they have different position from religion, and so on. So the peace protest is a great manifestations of people owning their faith, but also owning their traditions and reconciling with the concepts of peaceful resistance.
Thank you, Hala. Thank you for that. I know that Dr. Malik Roshan have raised your hand. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Hi. Can you hear me?
Hello, go ahead. Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes. Very good evening to everybody. Having heard the speakers, it is wonderful. It was a thought-provoking session. Everybody talked about, investing in education. People should engage. People should come out and speak about their rights. And we should, we all need to change our perspective of people viewing the Islamic world or the Muslim community, for example. So I am from Kashmir, and in this part of the world, we have recently had a turmoil kind of a situation unfolding. See, when we talk about education and we talk about engaging in different kinds of situations so that we create a different kind of identity for ourselves, do you really think when all these means are under the control of the state, the administration, the media, and other means of communication, expression, etc., they're all controlled by the state, and the state wants not non-violent activism, it engages in violent means all the time. Do you still think there is means and scope for non-violent engagement?
Good. Thank you, Dr. Malik, for the provoking question as well. And I want to use this opportunity because we already only have about 8 minutes. So I want to make my last round with the speakers and respect the time for them and for everyone, and give you each about a minute only, with 60 seconds to respond, and maybe starting with the Chaiwat, if you have any response in general, but also can you respond to this challenging question by Dr. Malik?
Yes, let me answer this way. The proximity between religion and the state increase the likelihood of violence. I have seen no place where the proximity between religion and the state produce nonviolent action or fertile soil for nonviolent action. So that one has to be guarded very carefully. The other point I wanted to talk about very quickly is about the balance that one asked Fatima, I think, between Tariqa and Sharia. To me, Sharia is the law and Tariqa is the way. I think the solution is for the law to be directed by the way of inspired by the Quran and the prophetic traditions. I think that's would be the 1 minute answer to both questions.
I'm sorry, I know. I wish we had more time, which I want to hear you articulate and give the this dynamic. Your statement, I love it. The proximity between religion and the state did not produce much. The closer they are, they did not necessarily produce any peace or any non-violence product. So thank you for that. Mushtaq, I will go for you second. We didn't hear you for a few minutes now.
Yes, I would just add what basically has been emphasized is that even if non-violent kind of methods are time-consuming and it takes a lot of training, but still we don't have any other alternative as people, because everybody can't opt for violence, and violence certainly has not given us any substantial kind of success. So certainly non-violence is the way, but then it needs a lot of inculcation, it needs a lot of training, it needs ideological kind of backing. And then also there are a number of such stories, numerous stories, much more successful than the violent ones, where non-violence has proved to be quite prudent and pragmatic in achieving the goals. So with this emphasis, I think that's what I intended to add. And related to it, even in India, we witness within the Muslims, we have organizations like Jamiat Ulama-e-Hind, or people like Maulana Wahiduddin Khan, and earlier it was Maulana Abul Hasan Ali Nadwi, Ali Mia, who used this interfaith kind of dialogue to bridge the divide between the Hindus and Muslims. Our earlier Asghar Ali Engineer did a lot of efforts through his writings as well as by personally engagement for building the bridges between Hindus and Muslims through non-violent means. So non-violence is basically the future, but we need to understand it. Even if the state is much more brutal, we certainly don't need to be reactionary to it, and we don't need to opt for violence, because that's what the arms dealers, that's what the capitalists, that's what the politicians intend for us to do. And we need to get over that and choose non-violence as a future strategy and as a civil resistance for meeting our goals for different campaigns. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mushtaq, for reminding us with the classic argument why non-violence and not violence. Thank you again. I will go to Karim. Karim, do you have any concluding thoughts in 1 minute?
Yes, the Prophet, may God welcome him in glory and give him peace, said, he who does not show loving kindness, raham, will not be shown loving kindness by God on Judgment Day. And the Muslims worship Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the All-Merciful, the All-Loving. They should practice this type of loving kindness, which is the essence of a nonviolent approach. And the emphasis on militant Islam, on revenge, and on nursing grievances has hijacked Islam and derailed it from its original mission. And this is a very serious crisis for Muslims. And if they don't awaken to it and understand the threat that it has to their own faith, they will become marginalized and fade away. And it will become a small group, not a large group in terms of the essence. This is something we need to take into account. That's why we need to network. We need to have some formal institutionalized ways of bringing resources together. There should be a list of all Muslim and NGO organizations in the world. They can interact with each other and get funding and advice and counsel and direction. This still doesn't exist. The only thing equivalent to it is the list of Islamic civil society organizations maintained by the American security and military establishment, which they consider as threats to them. Thank you, and may God guide us and give us wisdom and courage.
Thank you, Karim, for the beautiful, encouraging remarks as well. So thank you again. Hala, you have 1 minute to tell us how do you see the context of Sudan and the link of what we talked about here. Thank you.
Just a lesson we have learned that diversity definitely is the key to nonviolence in political resistance. And I'm talking about diversity of faith, diversity of gender, and inclusivity. And the more we have people of diverse backgrounds engage in the political space and in the resistance space and in the change space, the more we can ensure that it's non-violent, and this is what we are trying to construct at the moment, and having more women as well involved definitely it reduces the potentials or possibilities of violence.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hala, for the closing note. We are 1 minute before, so if you allow me to take 4 more minutes to close this, in many ways, historic conversation. I have been, and again, I'm not going to summarize. You've heard lots of information and lots of details and good examples and cases. What I want to put this in the historical context. This is another conversation we're having on this important topic. These conversations have been part of since 1980s, at least in more systematic way. And I think it's part of what Mushtaq referred to, the need for training for a professional. And also it's part of what Karim talked about, the need for conversation, the need for intellectual exchanges. And it's part of the Mubarak question and others on the need for network among Muslims who work in this part. You cannot imagine how valuable is these networks that we can create here for advancing this field. Please look at it as another step into this. One of the first steps was done by Satha-Anand or by Karim Crow in the early 90s. Myself, Mubarak, Professor Abdulaziz Saeed, our Muallim from Syria, I've forgotten his name now, Jawdat Saeed, thank you, yes, Jawdat Saeed, and many others also who have written about this. So we are only contributing this conversation. I am left with many questions here, and some of them is really how deep we should go into the colonial roots and look at these causes that we dealt with. The challenge of applying nonviolence into an Islamic context. We've heard a lot from the speakers about Islamic approaches, but I wish we have really made the link more tangible, more clear. What is difference between Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Islamic nonviolence in Sudan? How is it different from the Orange Revolution in the Balkan? What is it the Sudanese doing today that makes it Sufi, that makes it traditional, that distinguish it and really makes it in traditional and cultural way? Also, we really need to balance how do we balance the critique between internal and external? We always say that we cannot use nonviolence because external condition, repression, colonialism, and Zionism, and imperialism, and all the isms, including chauvinism. How can we look more internally? What are the internal factors that are prohibiting us from dealing with nonviolence resistance? And again, probably the main question I would leave you with, how can this be an integral part of the education system? Education in the 57 Muslim countries, we've looked at it in many different ways. How much nonviolence resistance, how much nonviolence values and ethics, as Karim talked about it, is integrated and can be explicitly articulated into the education system? That's really the way forward, and that's really the way we can build on that type of input and that type of preparation for the future. I want to raise one more question regarding this notion of, can really nonviolence in Muslim societies be applied between the co-opted religious agencies with the regimes and between the militant Islam that also took part of the, also that kidnapped the Islamic theology and Islamic ideology in many ways? In between those two, between the co-opted and between the militant Islam, there is a huge gap, and that's the gap we're dealing with it. How can nonviolence in Islam be situated in the middle between those two those two streams in many ways. How can this be liberated from the co-opted group and also liberated from the militant Islam in many ways? Satha-Anand started with sentence. I think it captures the Islamic in many ways, Islamic and non-Islamic. He said, we need to work on non-violence in a way that we help those we fight to be more secure. That's really the core value in non-violent resistance. How can you help those that you fight to be more secure? And that's something I want to leave you with, as well as to look at the whole conversation as an opportunity for all of us to add and build more in our connection and network. Thank you for Michael, for David Hart, for Connor, for everyone at the Nonviolence International family. Thank you, Mubarak, for visiting us this time as well, and for your first question. I much appreciate all of the input that everyone has given here. Please join me in clapping together for each other as well. And thank you for the 50 people who remained with us here. Wonderful conversation. Thank you all.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.
Thank you. Alhamdulillah. Thank you.